Good evening, friends. We are very happy to welcome you here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Marjorie Haas. I'm the president of Rhodes College, and it is absolutely my honor to bring you words of welcome to this evening's gathering. The topic is bold, like the men who will address it. They are a terrific group, and I know we are in for a wonderful evening. When we stop and pay attention to the minds of Black men, we find inspiration, we find hope, we find joy, but I am mindful as well of the pain and power of what those minds often reveal to us. Truths that are hard, truths that hurt, not because challenge and pain are the goal, but because there's no way forward without a frank assessment of the past and the present. For Black men to claim their rightful place as intellectuals in the academy is already an act of resistance. For these men to do so under the banner of an investigation of the meaning of Black masculinity is transformative. If the intellectual work of Black men has been suppressed, appropriated, and ignored, the solution cannot be to simply extend the structural advantages accorded to white masculinity. What we need instead is an expression of a new form, a renewed form of manhood. The men on this panel embody for me a vision of that masculinity as it could be, as we need it to be. Masculinity is power, but not to dominate, the power to transform. Masculinity is anger, not the defensive anger that hides vulnerability behind violence, but the righteous anger that fuels relentless pursuit of justice. Masculinity as strength, not only the strength to run and jump and throw, but the strength of inner resolve. And masculinity as genius, not as a marker of individual worth, but as a beacon of social change. The lives of Black men matter. You matter to me, you matter to Rhodes College, and you matter for our world and its future. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, our friends.
Thank you, President Haas. Good evening. Welcome to this amazing panel on Black male intelligentsia. My name is Dr. Duane Loynes, and I'll be your moderator for the evening. Before we begin, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the myriad individuals and offices that made this event possible, including President Marjorie Haas in the Office of President, Provost Milton Moreland in the Office of Academic Affairs, the Office of Student Life, the Anthropology and Sociology Department, the Office of Alumni Relations, the English Department, the History Department, the Africana Studies Program, the Urban Studies Program, the Lynn and Henry Turley Memphis Center, and the Rhodes College Faculty Diversity and Equity Committee. In addition, the panelists and I would also like to extend our gratitude for the difficult behind-the-scenes work done by Leah Ford and Ira Lawson. And we are very grateful for the boundless encouragement and the creative vision of our Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion, Dr. Noel Chaddock. Please join me in thanking them. If time allows, we'll have a brief question and answer period at the end of our panel. On your seats, you should have received 2 index cards. A larger white card are for questions addressed to the entire panel, and the smaller cards will be for questions you want to address to an individual panelist. Given the size of the audience tonight, we will not be able to respond to all of the questions, but when the cards are distributed, if you can, please write your email address on the back of the card, and we will do our best to answer them after this evening. Black male intelligentsia. There was a time not too long ago when a panel entitled Black Male Intelligentsia would have been dismissed as an oxymoron. In later generations, perhaps a panel of this nature would have been solely a discussion about the crisis of Black men in higher education. This is not a surprise. The cultural legacy of our nation has been the construction of Black male bodies as ontologically defective threats to culture. And defective threats are not allowed to theorize, they are theorized about. We are object and never subject. We are perceived as predator and never prey. Against all of that, against this cultural inheritance and mythological construction that we still grapple with, allow me to welcome you for the next hour to an excursion into Black male excellence. Our panelists are Black male scholars, writers, activists who foreground their experience as Black men not as ancillary to their academic work, but as central to it. Even as we problematize this experience of Black men in higher education, the central tone of this evening will not be lament, but celebration. A celebration of these four brilliant minds, yes, but also a celebration of the potential of every Black male who flourishes in a world destined to consume him. Tonight, then, is a tour into the provocative brilliance of Black men in the academy. And as such, please allow me to introduce your tour guides for the evening. First, we have Professor Kiese Laymon. Professor Laymon is a Black Southern writer born and raised in Jackson, Mississippi. He's the author of Long Division, How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America, and a book you might have heard about, the New York Times bestseller, Heavy, an American Memoir. Now, that is the short and humble introduction that Professor Laymon sent me over the weekend, but I thought I needed more beautiful words to describe him. And when one needs beautiful words, there's only one place to go. So allow me to quote Dr. Zandria Robinson, who writes the following about the book Heavy. Quote, "I did not want to remember what I have found necessary to forget. Ready or not, Heavy remembers for me and for us all with the exquisite Black Southern precision of a post-soul blues. Its brilliance is in its intimate and firm reminder that we are more than what has been done to us by others and by this nation, and that we can and must unburden ourselves as we move towards freedom. With Heavy, Laymon, the chief blues scribe of our time, writes and plays us a path through the weight of things." Please welcome Professor Kiese Laymon. Next, we have Dr. Ernest L. Gibson III. Dr. Gibson is Associate Professor of English and Co-Director of Africana Studies at Auburn University. He received his PhD in Afro-American Studies from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He is the author of Salvific Manhood, James Baldwin's novelization of male intimacy, which will be released later this year and is available now for pre-order. An interdisciplinary scholar by training, his research lies at the intersection of literary, cultural, and queer theories, and often pivots on questions of manhood, masculinity, and vulnerability. He is currently at work on his second book project entitled Between Ritual and Rebellion, Black Male Joy and Vulnerable Masculinities. When it was first announced that Dr. Gibson would be making his return to Rhodes College, this is the one thing that everyone wanted me to say, so I'm going to say it. From 2012 until 2018, Dr. Gibson was an admired, respected, beloved, and now deeply missed professor of English here at Rhodes College. Please welcome back Dr. Ernest Gibson. Next, we have Dr. Charles McKinney. Dr. McKinney is an associate professor of history and the Neville Frierson Bryan Chair of Africana Studies here at Rhodes College. Dr. McKinney is a student of the Civil Rights Movement, whose work focuses on the creation of movements of liberation in Black communities, education, and Black women's activism. He is the co-editor of the recently released book, An Unseen Light, Black Struggles for Freedom in Memphis, Tennessee. This work, which includes brilliant contributions from our own Charles Hughes and Zandria Robinson, reminds the world that Memphis is more than the city where Martin Luther King Jr. breathed his last breath. Instead, Memphis has a long history of perseverance, struggle, and victory against racial injustice. Dr. McKinney is uniquely suited to speak to the isolation often felt by black bodies in white spaces. When he first started Rhodes College in 2005, he was one of only 5 black professors on campus. And because of that experience, Dr. McKinney has devoted himself to being a champion, a mentor, an advocate, and a friend of a generation of black professors on this campus and around the nation. Please welcome Dr. Charles McKinney. Our fourth panelist this evening is Dr. Andre Johnson. Dr. Johnson is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Memphis, where he teaches courses on rhetoric, race, religion, and communication. He is also the senior pastor of Gifts of Life Ministries. In addition to the book, The Struggle Over Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, co-written with Amanda Nell Edgar, he is the author of The Forgotten Prophet, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner and the African American Prophetic Tradition. He is also the author of the forthcoming book, No Future in This Country, The Prophetic Pessimism of Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. He is currently working on a new book entitled #White Church Quiet, The Role of Race and the White Church in America. Let me say the title again. #White Church Quiet, The Role of Race and the White Church in America. Dr. Johnson is the embodiment of someone situated at the nexus of scholar, pastor, and activist. Please welcome Dr. Andre Johnson. So, Professor Laymon, Heavy is an intensely personal memoir. You allow us into the crevices of your soul like few other authors that I've ever read. And yet your story, though personal, still resonates with all black Americans in America, black men in America. In the excerpt that you're going to read for us, you challenge the idea of a safe space for black men. On a college campus, much like Rhodes, a place where you should have been safe, you write that you still experienced racial terror. What are your thoughts on that?
Hello. Y'all are as well dressed as you are genius up here. That's how y'all do in Memphis. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I want to thank Dr. Chaddock for making this happen. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank Zandria, Jamie, and Marco for loving me and making Heavy possible in a lot of different ways. So I'm just going to read just 2 pages of this book. And I think all that the listeners need to know is that I just gotten kicked out of school for taking a book out of the library without checking it out. And this book is written to my mom. And so I'm trying to talk to her regretfully about what happened. All right. It's from a chapter called Soon. Thank y'all for being here. President George Harmon told you I was lucky not to be thrown in jail for taking the red badge of courage from the library without checking it out. He claimed if Millsaps turned the security tape of my taking the library book over to the police, they'd arrest me on sight. In addition to kicking me out of college and forbidding me from trespassing on Millsaps' property, President Harmon gave my work to a local psychologist who claimed I needed immediate help interacting with white folk before they would even consider re-enrolling me. I smiled while sitting across from you and George Harmon that day, not because I was happy, but because I really didn't think any student in this country could be kicked out of school for taking the red badge of courage out of the library. I didn't think it was possible because I didn't think my teachers in the middle of my city would let it happen. I assumed when we walked out of that office, all my professors would be waiting to meet President Harmon. I knew Jackson State would never kick out one of your students for improperly taking out a library book and returning it because they'd have to deal with you and your colleagues if they did. In the few minutes between when Harmon gave you the letter outlining my discipline and our walk out to the car, I realized that my professors at Millsaps College were nothing like you. By the time you put the key in the ignition of the Oldsmobile, we both accepted that I did not make it. I was no longer a student. I allowed Millsaps College to shoot me out of the sky, and any school I thought of transferring to would see that I was on disciplinary probation for fighting and get kicked out of school for theft. For the second time in my life, since that night when Malachi Hunter spent the night after punching you in your eye, I felt waves of shame that made me not want to be alive. Ray Gunn introduced me to the word anti-black 2 weeks before I got kicked out of school. I was talking to him about patriarchy, and he nodded and said that patriarchy was like anti-blackness. He said the problem with fighting white folks was even the most committed of black folk had to deal with their own relationships to anti-blackness. I told him how Lathan and I used to say and believe something called black abundance. He said I should have learned a lot more about black abundance before I got kicked out of school for making educating white folks at Millsaps my homework. He was right. And Zola begged me to do more organizing with folk at Jackson State. Malachi Hunter begged me not to waste time fighting white Mississippians for free. Ray Gunn told me Millsaps would do anything to get rid of ungrateful black students. Grandmama told me to put my head down and get good at parts of school I disliked. Dr. Jerry Ward, who was still teaching at Tougaloo College and wrote the introduction to the version of Black Boy we read in class, suggested I transfer to Oberlin and work with Calvin Herndon long before I got kicked out of school. You begged me not to let those folks shoot me out of the sky. I'm sorry for not listening to you. I didn't listen to one black person who loved me, because listening to black folk who loved me brought me little pleasure. I'd fallen in love with provoking white folk, which really meant that I'd fallen in love with begging white folk to free us by demanding that they radically love themselves more.
Dr. Gibson. Yes, please. Dr. Gibson, can you speak to this issue of black male vulnerability that Kiese writes about?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of lines that I think can tie in nicely with black male vulnerability. I want to, instead of asking a question that speaks directly to it, maybe share some thoughts that could provoke a few things. So the first thing, and I don't think the question necessarily allows us to open it, so I'll just open it, is when I read this moment, I was immediately struck by the way in which you center your mother as the direct you in this moment, but also in the entire memoir. And so part of my thinking is how the centering of the black mother, the centering of the black grandmother, the centering of black women might be imagined as a kind of black male radical intellectual praxis, right? So outside of thinking about aesthetic choices that we often get when we're talking about creative writing, how as a black man creative writer, as a black male scholar, how in making your mother the you, right, and centering your grandmother so heavily in the text, you're engaged in this amazing kind of intellectual performance. So that's one thought. I'm going to give them all. The second is the narrative itself. And so I love, and by love, I mean I cringe, I mean I curse, I mean I get angry with how the black male intellectual subject, right, like you in this moment is always already criminal, right? And so the idea of thievery, right, not just the stealing of the book, right, but the idea of thievery, right, is so layered. And so here I'm thinking about how knowledge, how intellectuality, how academic product is configured as the object of whiteness. And so in your pursuit of that, you become a thief, right? Because this doesn't belong to you. I'm also interested in the way in which Millsaps and JSU, Jackson State University, are juxtaposed. And you don't go into depth in the memoir, right? But this idea that an institution that's invested in whiteness is already kind of prioritized in a way in which an institution that centers, right, or supports blackness like Jackson State is not. And so the conversation, right, that you're having with your mother when you say, Jackson State would never label me a thief because it sees me as someone who deserves intellectuality is there. And then the last 2 points that I think tie in with this larger notion of black male intelligentsia, the first, and I'll mention it and leave it there, is when you end falling in love with provoking white people sounds a lot like, for me, the Du Boisian preoccupation with beating white folk and beating them in such a way that you gain acceptance or visibility or a right to that intellectuality, right? So I'll leave that there. But I think what resonates most deeply and probably connects most deeply to the notion of a black male intelligentsia is this phrase that's somewhat haunting, and that is, right, being shot out the sky, right? And so for me, every time I read that, particularly in the context of this panel, I'm thinking of how might Kiese's phrasing, right, his kind of dark capturing of this condition, this phenomenon, be the precise articulation of black male intellectual plight, right? That in a world where, the pursuit of scholarship or academic achievement or creative writing is supposed to help us ascend out of plight and poverty and dysfunction, quote unquote, or disadvantage, quote unquote, it comes with the forever marking of a target on our back, right? That the threat of always being shot out the sky is looming, and how that, again, kind of colors this path, right? So those are thoughts that I want you to help me think through.
I like it better when the panelists are not as smart as me. I'm not going to... That's my favorite panel. Thank you so much, brother, for offering that and for giving yourself to the text. In the spirit of timeliness, I will say that, when I went to school, I think I conflated making my grandmother and mother proud with loving my grandmother and my mother. I didn't understand how to use the English language that I was learning how to manipulate in all of these ways. I didn't know how to use that language to actually actively love my mother and my grandmother. And I thought loving my grandmother meant evading white people and also taking shots at them when I could. What I'm trying to say in this chapter and also in this book is that there's a consequence for getting artistic competency and not loving the people who made you possible. And so telling white people about white people at Millsaps College to their face made me feel really good, but that was not loving the people who made me possible. It took me 30 years post that to write a book called Heavy that is actually not just a love letter to my mother and my grandmother, but a love book written to my grandmother and my mother to actually say, one, I'm sorry for conflating making you proud and loving, but also saying that I'm sorry for my preoccupation with white supremacy at that school. What I should have been doing is telling white people in a myriad of ways we can tell white people who they are, but spending a little bit more time tending to my insides, tending to our communities, thinking about the role of cis heteropatriarchy, thinking about the ways transphobia dictates so much of how we move through the world, and actually thinking about the layers and layers and layers of my life with my parents and my grandparents that I didn't want to touch. That was harder than telling white people they racist. Retrospectively, I didn't tell white people at my school anything they didn't already know. And the weird thing is, what we know, I'm sure at Rhodes and all these other liberal arts white colleges around the country, is that they do not like when you tell them what they know about themselves. And I just loved provoking them. You know what I mean? Like I just loved telling them what they should have known. And I loved it so much. And then one day, the president of this institution is like, yeah, you love telling us about ourselves. And I love kicking niggas out like you. And we got kicked out of school, and I say we because my mother was in that room with me when I got kicked out of school. We went to the zoo. We walked around the zoo in Jackson, Mississippi, and she told me for the first time in my life that my grandmother was not going to be proud of me and that she was going to be ashamed of me. And I couldn't understand, in a way, why. And then she said, Key, because you got kicked out of school for fighting and for theft, nobody who knows anything about this case is going to be like, he got kicked out of school for trying to tell the truth. So the truth is that ever since I got kicked out of school for trying to tell white folk what they already knew about themselves, I tried to commit my life to using my talent, my gift that was given to me by my grandmother and my mother to actually love them and love the creases and love the secrets and love the darkness and love the sublime shit that makes us us. And that does not at all mean that I think, black folk at these institutions should not tell white folk who they are. I think we have to. I think we have to make spaces for ourselves, but we also have to tend to our internal lives with that art that we're given. And tending to our internal lives sometimes, to me, can feel like telling white folk that they're white. Newsflash, they know. They just hate for us to tell them. So I want to say something that's kind of complicated. I want to say that I hope young black students in this country fight and connect with one another, tell the truth, speak truth to power whenever you can. But also I hope that young black students in this country accept what I couldn't accept when I was a student, which is that I am a student, which means I need to step into these classrooms and allow myself to be dumb, knowing very well that white folk think we are all dumb regardless. And I think this is a big thing I just want to say, but if I don't say anything else today, when I was in undergrad, I never allowed myself in a classroom to be a student, because every second that I had the mic, quote unquote, I wanted to tell white folk about themselves. I never felt like I could be like, I don't know. Can you help me? I'm confused. Because I felt like I had the weight of all of these folk behind me, and I felt like that weight did not allow us space to talk through and to failure. But if you're not talking to and through your own failure, you're not only not loving yourself, you're not loving the people who made us. So if we have opportunities to be in these academic institutions, and we have and you earned them, please use your art to interrogate yourself. Please use your art to interrogate the creases in your family that they might not want you to interrogate. And save a little bit of time to stun on white folk, because that's pleasurable too. But if it becomes your entire pleasure, I think we're doing our families, I think we're doing the people that made us, and I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. So thank you.
Dr. Gibson, in the past decade or two, there's been a resurgence of interest in James Baldwin. And his work is being mined not just for his vast contributions to literature, but also as a prophetic voice with regard to racial injustice. But in your work, and in the beautiful excerpt you're about to read for us, Baldwin reminds us of the fragility and yet beauty of black masculinity and the desire to be seen. Could you speak to that?
Absolutely, or at least I think I can. One of the struggles I've had in pushing out this project, and I'm never one to make an excuse for when things come into the world. They come when they're supposed to, but I felt a very heavy kind of anxiety about producing a work that I think would make Jimmy proud. I didn't achieve it still, right? But I'm just saying that weight, right, was on me a little bit. This is from the conclusion of the project. It's entitled Somewhere in That Wreckage. In Karen Thorson's acclaimed documentary on James Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket, there's a moment near the end, right before Baldwin speaks eerily about the New Jerusalem, right before the viewer hears him singing Mahalia Jackson's rendition of Precious Lord, where his brother, David Baldwin, invites the viewer into a profoundly emotional space. David relays to the viewer, who at this point has become more witness than spectator, some of Baldwin's last words before his death. He remembers, I pray I've done my work so, that when I've gone from here, in all the turmoil, through the wreckage and rumble, when someone finds themselves digging through the ruins, I pray that somewhere in that wreckage they'll find me. Somewhere in that wreckage they can use something that I left behind. And if I've done that, then I've accomplished something in life. End quote. There's something in these words of Baldwin, something in this offering from his brother highlighting the need for us to read and reread his work, to rethink his life. Perhaps the most striking element in the experience captured by the documentary is the bearing of male vulnerability. For James Baldwin, this vulnerability emerges from the prayer cloaking his work. This prayer, which is more supplication than petition, is a wish to be found, a hope that someone will stumble across his beautiful nakedness in their wrestling with his work. And if we look closely, we find just that, a beauty and a nakedness, slightly hidden within the guises of fiction and the blindness of cultural misreadings. Even more, we witness his fragility, how soft his manhood and masculinity are to the touch of the reader's gaze, his fear and excitement to dance freely and openly with his reader. Beyond this, Baldwin also tells us there's a lesson in his vulnerability, a didactic treat for those willing to read the textuality scripted upon his manhood. And it is this textuality which hovers above the reader, which haunts and lingers under constructions of character and plot and setting and theme and trope. Of course, Baldwin's hope, or more accurately, his prayer, is for us to look beyond the perfectly placed furniture and into the crevices of the corner. He is praying for us to see how the shadow we often miss is the very being he desires for us to see, to witness, and it is there where we will find him.
Thank you. Dr. McKinney, can you speak to this reconceptualization of black masculinity that Dr. Gibson is offering to us?
No. But I'll try. First off, we miss you. I miss you, my beautiful baby brother. I miss you. So, some musings. From supplication to insistence, Ernest, Gibson, James Baldwin, and the task of finding, seeing, and reading. In April of 1958, Ella Fitzgerald recorded her iconic Ella in Rome album, considered by many to be her very best live recording. There's all kinds of gems on this album, but the one song that continues to haunt me is her rendition of Angel Eyes. The song is a lament, an ode to a lost lover. And the last lines say, I gotta find out who's now the number one and where my angel eyes ain't here. And in the very last line, she says, she laments, excuse me while I disappear, while I disappear. So what strikes me about this song from the first time I heard it down to now is the juxtaposition of beauty, power, and vulnerability. This woman with this voice, the possessor of this vocal power, unmatched literally in the 20th century, rendered vulnerable, halting, and cautious. Her power in the service of her vulnerability makes for beautiful music. And we don't know what to do with that combination. We hardly ever do. That combination of power, beauty, and vulnerability. And that's part of why we're here, to deal with that combination. From my perspective, Ernest Gibson writes and lives in the vertices of these three elements: beauty, power, and vulnerability. His words, like the man himself, are unspeakably beautiful, and they carry a power with them that I have yet to fully comprehend. I have yet to fully comprehend. And armed with his beauty and his power, he takes us on a perilous exploration of his own vulnerability. And for tonight's purposes, an exploration of the vulnerability he finds in the work and life of one Jimmy Baldwin. What must we do to find Baldwin? What must we do to see Baldwin? So a couple of musings, and then I will turn it back to you, my beautiful baby brother. Hoping to find pieces of himself in the wreckage. right? I observe that Baldwin's usage of the word find there is much more passive than the way you use the word find, the way you seek to see Baldwin. So I'm struck by the intentionality that you use when it comes to finding and seeing Baldwin. He hopes we find, and you are telling us with your eloquent prose, we have to find. We've got to find Baldwin, and we have to see/read Baldwin. So we can spend all night talking about why that is, and I'd love to hear from you about that. Baldwin hopes simply to be found, but you are much more insistent about this. If we look closely, we can find, in another phrase you use, you say, if we look closely, we can find, quote, a beauty and a nakedness slightly hidden within the guises of fiction and the blindness of cultural misreadings. The blindness of cultural misreadings. I'm curious about what you're thinking about the relationship is between the guises of fiction and the blindness of cultural misreadings. There's a dynamic tension there that I think speaks to, right, how we can see and how we can think through and figure out Baldwin. What's the lesson in Baldwin's vulnerability, right? What can we learn? What's the learning there? What can we learn from Baldwin when it comes to creating spaces, intellectual, physical, emotional, for black men to breathe? And what role, most importantly, does a willingness to love and a call to protect play in this process? And I'm thinking about black folk on this campus with this question. What can we learn from this exploration of black male and female intelligentsia? And finally, Baldwin talks about this wreckage. What's the wreckage? What is this wreckage? And when you find things in wreckage, they are not intact. They are crushed, distorted, incomplete. So what you're talking about is the work of excavation. We're trying to excavate Baldwin, right? What do we hope to find in this excavation that can help us to point the way towards creating these viable spaces where black intelligentsia, male and female, can breathe and grow and thrive? That's all I got.
Can someone get my copy editor on the line? I've got a few revisions to the project. No, thank you for that chapter. No, seriously. This is me stalling. I'm like, Charles, what kind of nonsense is this, right? It's supposed to be, together in black intellectual solidarity, right? No, I'll start with the latter, right? The wreckage, somewhere within the wreckage. One is I think the endeavor, right? And so much of the endeavor is a part of my intellectual process, is I think a part of many black folks' intellectual process, a process as Kiese said, right, kind of centers love. Like, it's not just academic production, it's not just creative production. Like, I'm trying to atone, I'm trying to love, right, in a sense. And so my endeavor is extremely personal in my search, which is why I think, right, this slippage between my insistence and Baldwin's passivity is there as it relates to being found. But the wreckage, you're right, it's an excavation, right? Jesmyn Ward, Salvage the Bones, right? It's like, in the midst of storm, right? Like, all we see is the wreckage. And for black folk and for black intellectual folk, that's all we've had the fortune of being seen as, right, in many folks' eyes. And writers like Baldwin, writers like the folk on this panel have insisted that there is something in that wreckage. And I think that's Baldwin's lament. I think that's Baldwin's cry. I think that's his plea. That's mine. Now, what the wreckage actually is, we all know, right? White supremacy, cisgender, patriarchy, like all of the things, but also like the personal demons, right? So one of the things that Baldwin struggles with is just the desire to be loved, right? That's detached from race, that's detached from class status. It's just like, where will I find, right, the person who will love me? And so that's a part of the wreckage as well. I think black intellectuals are vulnerable subjects for a variety of reasons. One is because sometimes we come from a place that, in virtue of these kind of systems of oppression, doesn't understand that this work belongs to us. And so then when we emerge in these spaces, we read their misunderstanding of our subjectivities as rejection or denial. And so I'm thinking, when I go back home to my people and they're like, why do you sound like that? What are you talking about? Change your language. There was a moment in my life where I had to readjust and say, like, this isn't rejection, this is misunderstanding, right? But that's still a part of the intellectual struggle. And so we enter into a space where we imagine sanctum, right? Our libraries, right? Our institutions of higher learning, only to find that when we find like-minded individuals, right, who too love to read or to write or to calculate, that in virtue of your racial demarcation or your sexual identity, you're rendered outside of that community. And so you're left sometimes feeling, like Barksdale tells Stringer Bell, like, you're a man without a country, right? Like you feel homeless in a sense, and that makes you vulnerable for me. And then the other part, and this is to my insistence, and I'll stop talking for a moment, is that the vulnerability that I see in Baldwin, one is that, like, it's beautiful, it's smart. For me, Baldwin is one of our fiercest literary critics. And by literary critic, I mean, right, like, no one read America as a text as precisely as Baldwin, right? And this is Baldwin without degree, right? And so Black intellectual praxis is also a restructuring, a reconfiguring of how we understand Black intellectual product, but that's a side note. But what's in Baldwin is a recipe for how to do this work, right? That, I'm insistent because I think vulnerability is a key to kind of pushing this work a little bit farther, right? And so I often get frustrated with writers, very honestly, when I'm reading their work and it's so technically sound, it's so amazingly researched, and there's no heart in the text, right? Like, I'm turning pages, but there's no beat, right? And I'm looking for them there, right? Because for me, right, like, intellectual production is about leaving traces of yourself in the text, right? So that people can, if they care enough, find you, right? And that's what I'm committed to in the work with Baldwin, is finding him and telling him from my small corner of the world that I see you, right? That you're visible, that you mean something, because that's often what we're missing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dr. McKinney, one of the things I respect about you is your deep and abiding love for this city. You say often, you've taught us, that Memphis is underappreciated and under-researched. And you don't just say it, but this new book offers the world a counter-narrative about Memphis and its place in history. One of the themes in An Unseen Light is the struggle by Black Memphians who had to settle fights they neither started nor wanted. They were, in a sense, thrust into difficult situations that they had to manage in order to survive. We know for a fact that young Black men often come to predominantly white institutions like Rhodes, and just like Memphians, they have to fight, they have to settle fights they neither started nor wanted. They are put in positions where they have to fight in order to survive. Could you speak to that?
No. But I'll try. So before my excerpt, I have a preamble that I need to read. 1976. I am 9 years old, in the third grade. I've just moved from Jefferson City, Missouri to Goleta, California. It is the third week of school. It is 10 a.m. in the morning, and I'm quite certain that in exactly 2 hours, at lunchtime, Joey Montgomery is going to call me a nigger. When I first came to my new school on the first or second day, Joey greeted me with a chirpy, "Hello, nigger." I was stung by this, as I hadn't even niggered yet. I got a few of these a week. Hello nigger here, hello nigger there, and chalked them up to Joey's simple cruelty. But over the course of the first 2 months of school, I began to see the patterns. I came to see the signs and actions that led me to getting niggered by Joey Montgomery. This was the only education that mattered to me in 1976. If Joey was late to school and in a bad mood, I was getting niggered. If Miss Barnett asked Joey to read, it wouldn't go well because he wasn't a good reader. Other kids would snicker as he made his way through the sentences, nigger. Joey likes Norma Blanco, who sits next to me in class. Norma and I will eat lunch together on a regular basis. For the duration of his crush on Norma, nigger. I'm faster than Joey Montgomery, so if there's ever a foot race, nigger. So, by the third week of school, I could predict with stunning accuracy whether or not Joey Montgomery would regale me with nigger. At the beginning of the second month of school, Joey gave me one nigger too many, so I hit him and was sent directly to the principal's office. Mr. Ottinger, a chain-smoking administrator, reprimanded me vigorously for resorting to violence. He informed me that he'd called my mother, Lil McKinney. My mom came to campus. She endured Mr. O's required recitation on conflict resolution. Seconds after he finished, my mother, a former science teacher, stood up and said, "Let me see his official record." Mr. O responded, "Why would you want to see that?" She said, "Let me see his official record." Mr. O took my mom into the bowels of the office. He pulled out a long file drawer and pulled out my school record. Regarding the incident, my file read as follows: Chucky McKinney has a problem being black. May need behavioral supervision. My mother cut her eyes at Mr. O in a way I'd never seen her cut them before. I'm surprised he survived. He smiled, fumbled for a pencil, and said, "Here, let me fix that right now," and dutifully erased the words that would have consigned me to a fate quite different from the one I currently inhabit. I learned cursive that year. I learned a lot about the nation of Norway for a project that I had to do that year. I learned that Joey's calling me a nigger would never rise to the level of punishable behavior that year. I learned that if I wanted to navigate the lily whiteness of Goleta, California, or Rhodes College, I would have to learn white folks so that I could anticipate the violence many of them would send in my direction. I learned that my mom and dad were defenders, protectors, and systems analysts who knew that the institution would punish me and not Joey, and would punish me in permanent ways. I learned about how violence can be casually made to shadow my presence, all with the stroke of a dull pencil. That's my preamble. Now I'm going to read what I was supposed to read. Where on a timeline in Memphis history would you place the following scenario? In the wake of the killing of an unarmed black person, black Memphians organized mass-based protests, community meetings, and voter registration drives. These actions represented a collective response to the persistence of police brutality, economic and residential segregation, racist urban policy, and the palpable ambivalence of the city's political leadership. These sustained efforts to confront racial inequality resulted in both increased political influence and heightened retaliation from the white power structure. Would you place this scenario in the nadir of American race relations, perhaps early in the 20th century? How about in the 1940s? Certainly this sounds like something that could have happened in the 1960s, or perhaps you would be inclined to place it somewhere in the post-civil rights period. Regrettably, it is a scenario with an all too familiar feel. It is a summation of a recognizable cycle: Black death, collective action, tentative progress, backlash, repeat. This scenario can be placed on multiple points of the city's historical timeline. It is thus a grim testament to the enduring, some would say intractable, nature of racial equality in the Bluff City. These lines could be referring to the murder of L. Persons and the subsequent response, which one of the authors in the volume describes. This could be the telling of the story of Fred Jackson's murder and its aftermath, a story relayed in another essay. The pattern holds for other incidents as well, Whether it is the exclusion of black women from high-paying union jobs, the shooting of a civil rights activist, the coordinated effort to intimidate law-abiding black citizens, or the jagged enforcement of segregation in the wake of a natural disaster, the cycle remains consistent. For black folk in Memphis, the constancy of racial subordination pervaded every facet of life. As one historian put it, quote, "There was neither escape from nor redress for the ubiquitous, arbitrary, and cruel reality of senseless white power," end quote. However, just as the above scenario reflects the enduring nature of the racial subordination and inequality black Memphians confronted, it also represents an opportunity to contend with the equally enduring reality of black insurgency, black agency, rooted in a deep and abiding determination to pursue greater freedom. Black folk in Memphis responded to the ubiquitous, arbitrary, and cruel with bold directives, meticulously planned actions, slow-cooked resistance, and impromptu responses, all buttressed by a dynamic sensibility that enabled them to craft theories of thought and action that anchored their struggle. As we have seen throughout this volume, violence perpetrated against black Memphians begat political organization and incremental increases in political power. Throughout the 20th century, employment discrimination begat mass mobilization, which emboldened individuals and their organizations. Black folk from all walks of life shaped the pursuit of greater freedom by laying claim to their humanity and mounting an array of seen and unseen actions.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson, can you speak to this idea of black men having to learn their environments? And maybe you want to draw on your own experiences growing up in North Memphis.
First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here, Dr. Chaddock, and what can we say about these panelists already? Y'all show them some love again. I don't know how I became a part of all of this, but I'm going to try to just say a few words. First of all, let me just shout out Chuck McKinney, because in my book, and if you notice in the introduction, so glad that Unseen Light came out, because the history of Memphis part, you left the breadcrumbs and I just came right by and just scooped them up. So we're so thankful for that. But I felt that though, all of that. Much of that history, I know. I'm from Memphis. I'm from a part of Memphis that lived some of that history. I worked with the people who erected the marker remembering L. Persons, and with the Lynching Sites Project, and growing up in North Memphis, Tennessee, Lane and Ayers, Dixie Homes, Dunlap, Manassas, Humes Junior High School, all of that, Carnes Elementary. I understand when I was reading not only the coda, but just the entire book, I really felt a lot of that, because I knew some of the people who were affected by it. Some of the people were in my family. Some of the people that I knew, Miss So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, they knew people who were actually lynched right here in the city of Memphis. So growing up in North Memphis, Tennessee, growing up wanting to go into the pool hall as a little boy, however, not being allowed to by some of the folk in the pool hall, because they saw something in me and said, if you come around here, I'm going to tell Miss Rose, my mama, on you, and you need to just go on back, stay in school, do all you. And I'm a little boy, but getting love from the community in a way that I did not understand at the time. So when you talk about the history of Memphis, and I'm so glad that you did that and lifted that up, I am just utterly, I felt it, but I'm utterly amazed that a lot of people that grew up like me in Memphis don't know this. And it reminds me of how I see it, two different worlds that we live in. Like, stuff can just be oblivious to people who grew up just like me, my age, same timeline, and not know some of this stuff. So being a black man, being a pastor, being a community organizer and an activist and an academic, researching some of this stuff, I feel a call to lift up what you lift up in the book, but also not only just talk about it, but to live it, to be an example of it, to go out and to stand with, to bear witness with. So one of the things that I just want to, ask so you can kind of expound on about the reading how did it make you feel when you began, because you're not from Memphis, but when you began to love Memphis like you do and want this to come out, and when you unearth these stories, how does it feel for you when you see the story of ill persons, or you see the story of striking sanitation workers, or people that are being abused constantly by the police, and how Squad, you and I and others who are going out here and still bearing witness to a lot of this stuff? I want to know how it feels to you, my brother. How does it speak to you, and how does that affect your scholarship?
So you're going to start with the small question, right? The small question. So thank you for your comments. So I think about Memphis, and I think about Rhodes, and I think about you all, the faces I see out here in this audience, right? And I think about, and that's why I wrote the preamble, right? Because one of the things that I was the beneficiary of was being able to grow up in an environment that explicitly named and sought to name the forces that sought to destroy me in a really clear way, right? So my mom laid that out for me. This was going to be in your school file for the rest of your academic career, right? And so back to Memphis, back to this place, one of the things that I keep thinking about, and Ernest's words knocking around in my mind, Kiese's words knocking around in my mind, but the word that comes to mind for me is sanctuary, right? And the ways in which sanctuary can help us to make sense of the world around us, can help us to build a critique of the world around us, the world in which we inhabit, can help us to make sense of our place in that world, can help us to make ourselves accountable for the harm we produce, for the love that we can help perpetuate. It helps us, a sense of sanctuary helps us to understand, to quote those African-American philosophers, Frankie Beverly and Mays, right? Joy, pain, sunshine, rain, right? And it's from that place of sanctuary, then, that we can go out and confront the atrocity that we face, right? I'm a historian of the civil rights movement. And so I've spent the last 20 years reading about how people come from frequently a place of sanctuary. And sanctuary is not perfect, right? Sanctuary is me with my mama, right? Me with Big Mama, me with my friends at the pool hall, me with whoever I'm in community with, right? And those people, in their perfectly imperfect way, giving me the tools to make sense of where I am, who I am, and also giving me the tools to confront, to have the wherewithal to think that I can actually change some stuff, right? So that's kind of what I think about, right? So when I do the research about Memphis and I bump into all of these amazing stories about people who have done all of this work to get us where we are, and I also read about all of the work that gets done to undo all of the work that people do, right? I've been out of college for 30 years, right? So the complaints that Memphians have about segregated schools in 2019, that's the same complaint that folks had in 1989, 1969, 1959, 1949. Why is that? Because for all of the work that we have done to try to bring equity to the city of Memphis, right? We see that work being erased with a smile, right? And stickers that say progress. It's a great place to work, great place to live, great place to visit, great place to come and, be a white millennial or whatever, right? So for me, right, I think a lot these days about the power of sanctuary and what we derive from sanctuary. We can go out and do wonderful and beautiful things in society while we are wounded. And that's frequently what we have to do because we don't have a choice, right? We don't get to sit up and get fixed and then go try to confront some shit. We don't have the luxury of being able to do that, right? But we can love each other. We can hold each other close. We can hold each other lovingly accountable for our actions. We can figure out how to plot plots and plot schemes together. We can both figure out where we need to bang against the walls, where the next march needs to happen, where the next protest needs to happen, but we can also, in that sense of in that jagged sense of community, we can also come together and just be quiet. Right? We can come together and cry, laugh at something wildly inappropriate, right? Eat somebody's good cooking, not the bad cooking, but the good cooking, right? So that's kind of what I think about when I think about Memphis and when I think about Rhodes, right? When I think about my time on this campus, how important that sense of sanctuary is and how important it is for us to create that for students in pockets and spaces here because they don't feel that sense of sanctuary in so many places and spaces on this campus, right? And to also affirm, I'll say this and I'll shut up, to affirm just how hard this is, right? One of the things that I think a lot of our students and a lot of folk in Memphis feel like, I'm supposed to be up for this, right? I'm supposed to be able to weather this, right? I'm supposed to be strong in these particular sorts of ways. I'm smart, right? I'm this, I'm that. My mama loves me. The people at the church pat me on my head and kiss me on the cheek when I go back for Sundays. I'm supposed to be prepared for all of the stuff that I'm confronting. And this stuff is systematically breaking me down. It's breaking me down every day. And we've got to create a space where we can say, yeah, I know. I've been there. We've been there. We've walked on this campus and have gotten side eyes from our colleagues. We've walked on this campus and have been asked for ID on the way to our offices. We've walked on this campus and have had people say, "Why are you here?" We've been there. And we know what that assault does to us. We know what it does to you because we know what it does to us. Right? And so these places of sanctuary, right, are places where we can come together and speak these truths and rest in those truths as we lick wounds, as we plot and scheme, as we figure out ways to get through organic chemistry or English or history or religious studies or whatever it is you're studying, right? And reminding ourselves, right, and reminding you all that work is important, but that's not the only piece of work that you are going to be tasked with doing here. Just like back in 1976, cursive and my times tables in Norway, right, were not the only pieces of work I was responsible for. I was responsible for trying to figure out how to navigate this space that was openly hostile, right? This space where I went in the first day of class and Miss Barnett said, "Oh, here comes trouble." I hadn't even niggered yet. Wow, trouble? But I'm a good reader. But I'm so smart. But I'm in the honors program. None of that matters. It's irrelevant, right? So, sanctuary. That's the word I keep coming back to. So, that's it.
Thank you.
That's a good word.
Yeah. Sanctuary is a good segue for Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson, in your work and in the excerpt that you're going to read, you're making a case for a broader notion of religion, one that draws upon the folk prophetic tradition of African American struggle, and one that is large enough and capable enough to include a movement like Black Lives Matter. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I do like that word sanctuary, because them same guys in the pool hall did sneak me in, and I can play some mean game of pool. This is from chapter 3 of the book, The Spirit Led Me, and I talk about Andrew Wilkes' notion of Pentecostal piety and kind of just broaden that out a little bit to get this expanded notion, as Dr. Loynes said, about my work. So, the idea that the mid-20th century civil rights movement was decisively and singularly religious reflects a misremembering of the communal nature of the 1960s Black liberation movement. Even among the leaders, the theology of the movement was unsettled, other than to recognize the importance of working toward a cause larger than the individual. Drawing from Andrew Wilkes, we know two major points about Pentecostal piety. First, Pentecostal piety places a heavy emphasis on the role of the Spirit. Proponents of this type of spirituality are not locked into rigid confines of religious orthodoxy. In many cases, people practicing this brand of spirituality are not affiliated at all with any religious institution. They are free to move as the Spirit leads and guides. For example, many Ferguson activists describe feeling, quote, called, or as though, quote, something pulled me in that direction. It was the talk of the Spirit that led many people to join the Ferguson resistance, and consequently, many activists there interpreted their, quote, call stories as an extension of the Spirit working in their lives. In keeping with Wilkes' notion of Pentecostal piety, that something led people to find their own voices and discover their own gifts and talents. Moreover, it was those voices, gifts, and talents that helped lead to the establishment of building a common good society among individuals of differing backgrounds and moral commitments. While the Spirit moved in those individuals, the Spirit also moved collectively and led many of those who joined to sense a new community where they could set aside their differences and focus on what brought them together. Second, Pentecostal piety prioritizes prophetic action, framing particular approaches to activism as a subversive civil religion. Prophetic, in this context, refers to the crucial role of religion in offering a critical perspective on justice, oppression, and the contours of a moral society in general. To borrow Florian Horn's phrasing, prophetic witnessing emphasizes the crucial role of religion rather than a comforting one. Therefore, a person or group who engages in prophetic or critical witness is pointing to the distortions in society and criticizes injustice, exploitation, and oppression. Framed this way, BLM acts as a prophetic movement that provides witness to the contextual realities faced by many African Americans. In other words, BLM is part of the long African American prophetic tradition. And somewhere else I wrote about this tradition, that it was birthed from slavery, shaped in Jim and Jane Crow America. The African American version of the prophetic tradition has been the primary vehicle that has comforted and given voice to many African Americans. Through struggle and sacrifice, this tradition has expressed Black people's call for unity and cooperation, as well as the community's anger and frustrations. It has been both hopeful and pessimistic. It has celebrated the beauty and myth of American exceptionalism and its special place in the world, while at the same time damning it to hell for not living up to the promises and ideas America espouses. It is a tradition that celebrates both the creators or the divine's hands in history, offering hallelujahs for the deliverance from slavery and Jim and Jane Crow, while at the same time asking, where in the hell is God during the tough and trying times? It is a tradition that develops a theological outlook quite different at times from orthodoxy, one that finds God very close, but so far away. BLM is thus a descendant of previous African American prophetic movements in which people stand up and provide clarity and witness to the atrocities happening to Black bodies. Understood this way, the role of religion in social justice organizing does not limit the inclusivity of the movement, but rather it's a well aligned with the intersectional analysis that seeks to uncover all of the many and varied ways anti-Black racism influences contemporary society.
Thank you. Professor Laymon, and with this we'll conclude. One of the lines he just said at the end of his reading was the atrocities that happened to Black bodies. The atrocities happening to Black bodies. Can you speak about inhabiting a Black male body in 21st century America?
Are you asking me that question? I can definitely speak to that. Can I ask one question before?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. I'm just so happy to be on stage with a Black Southern preacher who wants to learn. And that doesn't mean that I have anything to teach you, brother, because I learned so much reading your book. But I'm always taken by this notion of BLM being leaderful, right? Just this idea we've heard about Black Lives Matter being leaderful, full of leaders. It disturbs me sometimes when people talk about leaderful movements as if BLM created leaderful movements, because I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and went to church in rural Mississippi and Forest, Mississippi. And in Forest, Mississippi, our church was leaderful, and it was full of leaders who happened to be cisgender Black women. Now, for the life of me as a kid, I could not understand how the people who made the most sense were these Black women, yet the person who made the least amount of sense was often a Black man preacher. And I wondered, as a young Black boy who learned a lot from Black women at my grandmother's home mission, when they were talking, why these preachers could not seem to learn what these sisters were talking about. So when I read this book and I hear you as a Black preacher say, among other things, that BLM has a lot to teach us, I feel like that's one thing you're saying. I'm very curious if we could get specific and talk about the ways that leaderful movement called BLM, led by the majority of cisgender Black women, could we talk about what specifically that movement around issues of gender and race taught you and other Black preachers that you know of in Memphis?
and I've shared this around the city before, so this is nothing new for people who've heard me talk about this when I get an opportunity to talk about the movement. My theology was already kind of out there, so I could embrace this already. Ferguson, though, changed my whole theological outlook. And this whole notion of white church quiet comes out of that, because all these black bodies are laying dead on the street, and I'm asking the question, why are white churches quiet? But I began to ask the question first within black churches, and when I opened myself up to womanist theology, for instance, when I opened myself, and as a black man, and let me locate it since it's the black male panel, that as a black man, we should be open to learn and to listen and to grow. And I think many of us are. And so that helps me understand my own theological outlook and to broaden this even the more, because so when I'm on the ground with BLF, I feel no ways different, no ways different than if I am in a church on Sunday morning in the sanctuary. I have been asked the question many times in the street, what are you doing out here? You're a preacher, and I said, my call, I feel led. I feel like this is what I'm supposed to do. I am called to do this. So I'm out there. So for me, it's just who I am. It's just who I am. It's just wherever I go, I don't put anything on the shelf. I'm a scholar activist. I'm both, and I just go wherever I go, and you see me hanging out and having a good time and whatever. That's who I am. But it helps that my theology is not small. The God I serve is not small, and much bigger than any of our classifications anyway. And it helps that I now, by at least attending a seminary, I can now have the language to share some of my feelings and frustrations and all of that as well too. So I am, for me, it is just who I am. And it started with me being open, and it did help that I did not grow up probably in the church. I was a late comer, and so I didn't have a whole lot of stuff to kind of drop, if you will. But hello, somebody. Oh, I feel my help now coming. I'm through, man. I'm through. Thank you for the question. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. I was about to take a text.
Yep. So this will conclude our panel for the evening. We will not have a time for Q&A, but if you have questions, please write them down, put your email address on the back, and I will collect them as soon as we conclude. Please join us downstairs in the cloister in just a few minutes for an opportunity to meet our panelists and to have your book signed. There will be Post-it notes on the table if you want to write your name down to get a personalized autograph. The books that the authors have talked about tonight are available downstairs and in our bookstore. Dr. Gibson's book, Salvific Manhood, is available for pre-order downstairs and in our bookstore. Or feel free to grab an event bookmark and have it signed to commemorate this evening. One last time, please join me in thanking Kiese, Laymon, Ernest Gibson, Charles McKinney, and Andre Johnson. All right, you may be seated. Dr. Gibson has requested that we take a few questions, okay? So if you have a question, please write it down, raise your hand, and it will be collected, and we will try our best to maneuver the best we can.
The questions are coming.
I'm trying not to get in trouble, but all right. This is for the panel. When speaking to a sense of sanctuary at Rhodes, how are black students supposed to feel when faculty like Professor Gibson are leaving?
I have to calm myself down. Let me just say, I don't teach here, so it makes it easier for me to say some of the things I'm about to say. And I love to bite the hand that feeds me, particularly if that hand is white and elite. So there are a lot of ways I think you judge the integrity of an institution. Lots of ways you judge the integrity of an institution. What I think we have to start doing as people who make institutions like this our home is demanding that if professors, for example, like Dr. Gibson leave, and they're giving wonderful options other places. This is very awkward, brother, but you know I love you, so I'm just using you as an example. Institutions that are worth their salt have to make it so this brother will not leave. That's what you do. You make it so this brother right here does not leave. You make it so Zandria Robinson does not leave. And if they do leave, you have to make sure that they left because they crazy. You know what I'm saying? If I'm an administrator, I'm like, let's just see if this motherfucker's crazy. Because we about to throw everything in the world at them. Because in one way, and I want to deal with the second part of that question, and replace them. Real talk, fam. I love you. You do not replace this brother. That's what you need to understand as an administration. I know 3 professors here. I know you. I know Charles. I know Professor Zandria Robinson. If I was lucky enough to run an institution, I would give everything in my power to keep those people there, because you cannot replace people like that. And when institutions do not do that, it is up to you all to band together, organize, and not ask them why, but make them do what your school is supposed to do.
All right. Oh. All right.
So I'll respond to that too. I think that's just a reminder of how fragile our sanctuary is, right? It's a reminder of how tenuous it is here, right? And that's the other part of the real talk, right? That's the other part of the sanctuary of the sanctuary idea, right? Is we have to be honest with you, right? When you come here, about how tenuous this community is, right? And how, quickly parts of it can disappear for brighter horizons, right? And again, you have to, and you have to hear that. You have to really hear that, right? So yeah, I think that we just have to be honest about the tenuous nature, and also about what we, you know where we are, right? And how, what our staffing looks like, right? All the tenured black professors in the humanities department, in the humanities division, raise your hand. That would be me. It's just me. WTF? What are we doing about that, right? So that's the thing, right? That's the thing. We have to be honest with you about where we are, right? And about what we're willing to do and what we're not willing to do, right? When it comes to building a more vibrant space, a space in which all of our students can flourish.
Dr. Gibson, did you want to respond? One more. How are black men in a white-dominated world on a primarily white campus supposed to react to other black men?
You keep trying to force me to talk. I'm going to push the language a bit on that question. I think the oughtness of supposed to act, right, is a bit heavy of an expectation, right? I think black men who see black men at a predominantly white institution like Rhodes or any predominantly white institution that might be toxic, and in the many ways in which they are supposed to receive them as they're called to receive them. However, I think we long for a certain type of reception in light of the toxicity, in light of the violence. And I think longing is a fair expectation, but it's also a complicated one, because if we're responsible, we know that the longing doesn't guarantee a return. And in the absence of that return, we have no right to anger or rejection or denial. But I think, any black man on any campus like Rhodes or Millsaps or Amherst or Auburn, right? Different institutions, same problems, can rightly long, right? For us to love each other in a way that will allow us to overcome, to build sanctuary, no matter how fragile, right? Because those fleeting moments are enough to get us through the day. And I think if we love longing enough, if we respect longing enough, then, if it's the right one, right, then you get it, right? And you remind each other that while we might be different, right, because blackness is so beautiful in its variegation, right, that in this space, I'm longing for you to hold me, to love me, to be vulnerable with me. And when it happens, it makes the world of a difference, right? So I'm not going to respond to the last question directly, but I'll say, right, there were moments on campus, or in my moments on campus, when I felt unseen, when I felt less visible, right? There were people like Zandria, Meredith or Charles, right, who allowed me to long for sanctuary, and despite our differences, were strong enough to offer the little bit of themselves that they had left so that I could go up and teach again and again. And it's these beautiful students, black and brown and amazingly white, who would see me in the classroom. The funny thing is, we had a reception right before here, and our beloved president, right? You can't get away, right? Our beloved president, Marjorie Haas, said, "Welcome home." Right? And of course, there's some awkwardness in that extension, right? And that offering. But there's also some truth, right? Like you build a home, right? Where you built home, where you once built home doesn't disappear, right? You just build another, right? And so it's accurate, it's adequate. And I tell people I didn't leave Rhodes. I went to Auburn, right? Rhodes didn't push me out. It didn't stop me from going, though, right? But Auburn invited me in, right? And so, keep us, right? See us.
Thank you. Go ahead.
But I just needed to say this, that I think this panel has hopefully demonstrated is the vulnerabilities, black men being open, talking about sanctuary, talking about safe spaces, talking about being seen. Those things are real. Now, I see them a lot by the other role, the other hat I wear, pastor. I get to have these conversations with brothers a lot, and the struggles, and they feel like they can really come to me and open up. But I just hope that if there was any other kind of thing floating in your mind about black men, black masculinity, just know that this is true. This is honorable. This is good. This is healing. This is part of the journey as well.
Thank you. Once again, Kiese Laymon, Ernest Gibson, Charles McKinney, Andre Johnson. Meet us downstairs in the cloister, down the stairwell at the rear of the auditorium. Thank you.